I'll start off by welcoming everybody. Terrific. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm Peter Larson with the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I'm thrilled to have my old friend Jonathan Cook here with us today to share with us some of his experience as a journalist working in Israel and on the Israel-Palestine question. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here again, Peter.
Um, I also am joined by Pacinthe Mattar, who was with the CBC for 10 years. Pacinthe was a journalist with CBC. I first met Pacinthe about 2 years ago, I think. She was invited by the Carleton School of Journalism to come and talk about her struggles as a journalist trying to report on the Middle East. As an Arab-speaking journalist, she worked with CBC, and she had some difficulties with CBC direction in terms of what stories of hers that they would either accept or spike and so on. And so Pacinthe has left that and into independent journalism. So Pacinthe, thank you so much for joining us today. That's great.
It's great company to be in, Peter. Thank you. And nice to have an opportunity to talk to Jonathan about something we share in common, unfortunately.
And in the background, I'll have Grafton Ross, so you can see there in he will be disappearing into the background shortly. He is the vice chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and he will be handling your chats and your questions. So for everybody, I can say that the chat has been enabled, so you can write chats for everybody can see the chats. You can also put in questions in the Q&A, but Grafton will be monitoring that. Or when it comes to the discussion time, you can also raise your hand. Raise hand, and we'll deal with the questions that way. Jonathan, just back to you. Oh, I meant to say also that OFIP, of course, operates here in Ottawa on unceded Indigenous territory, and in recognition of which a member of our board gives his contribution every year to Inspire, which is a foundation for Aboriginal youth education. Jonathan, you have many reasons why I'm so grateful for you, but one is you were living in Nazareth when I first met you. Nazareth, the largest Palestinian, now second largest Palestinian citizen,
No, the largest, the
but the
largest.
largest in Israel.
Yeah.
And you were the one who really rubbed my nose in the fact that I had the idea that many Canadians have that Palestinians live in Palestine and Israelis live in Israel. And you sort of made it clear for me, well, that was not very, first of all, there are lots of Jewish Israelis living in the West Bank, but
Yeah.
there's also many Palestinians, about 20% of the population, nearly 2 million living inside the borders of Israel, and they have their own very specific challenges. And I am forever grateful for you for having straightened me out on that, because it took some work, because I had a preconception about how the world worked.
Well, I appreciate you bringing so many Canadians out and giving me the chance to show them a little bit of what life was like for Palestinians inside
Yeah, and
Israel.
Jonathan was a great tour guide. I used to talk to maybe at least a half a dozen times, went to different areas of Palestine or Palestine, Israel, to see the situation, and you were great at that. So thank you so much for that. And Jonathan has a great website, and we will put the link to that in the follow-up email so people can follow up Jonathan more substantially. So maybe I'll just turn it over to Passant to start off by helping me interview Jonathan about his experiences.
Thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me to do this. And Jonathan, I'm so thrilled to get a chance to speak to you as someone who's lived in the region, reported on the region, gives us a view from outside of what's happening in Canada, which is very similar. But let me start by asking you what you believe in your experience are some of the most widely held assumptions about Israel, Palestine, and Western media that are rarely challenged.
Well, I suppose the biggest, most fundamental one is this idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. I mean, that's the kind of starting point for all Western journalism. It's one I think that particularly an obstacle for me when I first went out there because I'd been working with the Guardian newspaper, which is seen as a very liberal outlet in the UK, and was actually at the time regarded as slightly anti-Israel. That had been the sort of presentation that the Israeli government was making about the Guardian. And I went out there. I wasn't their correspondent. They had a correspondent out there, but I had obviously lots of connections. I'd just been a staff member there for several years. And so I went out there and I was effectively a freelancer, but pitching stories regularly to The Guardian. And so one of the first obstacles I had was that I was based, as Peter said, in Nazareth, which is a Palestinian community inside Israel. And so my perspective on all of this was not to be thinking about uh, what was happening in the occupied territories. That wasn't my focus, that wasn't my emphasis, and also not to be thinking about it in the Western framework of a security issue.
Mm.
Most journalists go out there, they're based in Jerusalem, possibly Tel Aviv, or very occasionally Ramallah, but mostly in Jerusalem. And for them, the occupied territories are a security threat to Israel. And Israel is therefore, a lot of the things it's doing are legitimate because it's dealing with a security problem. If you step outside that framework and you're in somewhere like Nazareth, a Palestinian community inside Israel, which is no threat, there's no guns there, there's no threat to Israel, there's no security threat to Israel. You have to look at Israel-Palestine and the relationship slightly differently. And that was one of the first things I did. And I started to think about this question of what does it mean to be a Jewish state? And is it straightforward, the idea of it being a Jewish and democratic state? And I very quickly found that this was not an acceptable way for me as a journalist, and I think for all Western journalists. When you go out there, the expectation is you're going to focus on this issue of, are Palestinians a security threat? How much are they a security threat? Is what Israel is doing to deal with that security threat legitimate? So that's the whole framework of it. And you have to operate within that framework. If you step outside of that, as I did, and you start saying, well, hang on, are Palestinians really a security threat, or is this really something else going on here? Is this about Israel needing to be a Jewish state and finding it difficult to be a Jewish state when it's got a large Palestinian population it's trying to control, and starting to look at this question of what is a Jewish state? What does it mean? And can it be Jewish and democratic? And these were the issues that really I went out there I quickly found myself addressing and focusing on, partly because of my geographical location in Nazareth. And I very quickly realized that even a publication like The Guardian, which was seen as very supportive of the Palestinian cause, and even sometimes presented as being slightly anti-Israeli by the Israeli government, had no ability to deal with this kind of issue, didn't want to look at these questions, found them very, very difficult to address. And that's one of the, I suppose, the wake-up call. And this was part of my starting to question, what does it mean to be a foreign correspondent out there when you can't address this very fundamental question of what is Israel trying to achieve here? What does it mean by being a Jewish state? What are the goals of being a Jewish state? If we can't address those questions, and even The Guardian wouldn't look at these questions, then you start to think, okay, there's a fundamental flaw in our whole approach to the issue of Israel and Palestine. There's this kind of blind spot that we can't address and we can't look at. And I suppose it became clearer to me over time, and I think this was 20 years ago I started, or more than 25 years ago that this started for me, but I think it's clearer now that this question starts to become wrapped up with, is criticizing Israel as a Jewish state anti-Semitic? And this is, of course, something that the Israel lobby is determined to try and conflate this issue. If you're trying to say, well, are there problems with being a Jewish state? Could the issue that Israel has with a large Palestinian population it's ruling over, its occupation, its mistreatment and abuse of Palestinians who live inside Israel as second, third-class citizens, are these wrapped up with the problems of what it means to be a Jewish state? The lobby's interest is in shutting that conversation down immediately by saying anything that suggests that Israel isn't a wonderful Jewish democratic state is anti-Semitic. And I suppose now that argument is becoming harder for the lobby to sustain. The past 2 years, the genocide in Gaza has undermined that kind of argument. This is just not a question. Israel is a normal Western-style liberal democracy. It's been its presentation for a long time. It's very hard to sustain that in the face of what's been going on over the last 2 years. So I think people want to know, what is this kind of state? We know that the question of Israel as an apartheid state is another issue that the lobby has been very strongly trying to suppress. And the media has mostly avoided that topic. If you cast your mind back a few years ago, we started to see a series of human rights groups. It started with Amnesty, and there was Human Rights Watch, and even the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, the most important of the Israeli human rights organizations. They all came out in short succession and said that Israel was an apartheid state. You might have thought that would have had a dramatic impact on the coverage of the Western media. Here suddenly they had leading human rights organizations saying Israel was an apartheid state, and they might have felt more legitimate might have taken some of the pressure off them to address those questions. But actually, really, they just tried to push it down, repress it again. And so we couldn't really, as journalists, still talk about Israel as an apartheid state. That hasn't changed, and it's been reflected also in this issue of genocide. The lobby again has suggested that there's something anti-Semitic about suggesting what's going on in Gaza is genocide. And again, the media have mostly avoided using this terminology. They're very wary of calling Israel an apartheid state. They're very wary about referring to what's going on in Gaza as a genocide. And there's still this kind of implicit assumption, even though we have a very ugly, far-right, ultra-nationalist government in Benjamin Netanyahu's government, there's still this reluctance to not think of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So these are all really key issues for journalists, which we ought to be addressing, we ought to feel comfortable talking about, but we don't, because the lobby has very successfully implanted this idea that to even think about in these ways about Israel and what it's doing is anti-Semitic. So this is the big problem for journalists, this sort of fear of being labeled anti-Semitic.
Jonathan, I hope Bassett gives me permission here. I want to just leverage on that and come back to the kinds of constraints that a journalist in Israel lives under in terms of shaping the story. Our journalists, I think the only journalist I'm aware of is with CBC. CBC is our national broadcaster, and I think got a lot of strengths. But a CBC reporter in Jerusalem, how is he or she constrained either by law or by pressure to reporting a story that is acceptable to the Israeli government?
I'm not sure that there are some legal constraints, and I suppose one has to think about this in two different ways. And this is a big topic. You know, when you're a journalist, you arrive in Jerusalem, and what are you going to do? First of all, you've come with a set of assumptions, which will largely be implanted at a young age. Most of us who are living in Western states have grown up with the idea of Israel as a refuge for the Jewish people. We've also been raised with the idea that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state and so on. So we go there with the assumption somehow that Israel is the good guy in this story and the Palestinians are the bad guy. And so it's really about trying to sort out the details there. So the first thing that happens is you arrive with these preconceptions as a journalist. And then you're likely to be, almost always, you're going to go and live in West Jerusalem. So you've already Jerusalem, for those who aren't too aware of what's going on there, is a divided city. It's occupied by Israel in 1967. And Israel has a western side of the city, which seems very European or Western. Then it's got an eastern side of the city, which was largely occupied by Palestinian population. But Israel annexed it in 1967 and then slowly brought in more and more Israeli Jewish settlers. Israel called this a process of Judaization, and Palestinians there live in sort of ghettos in very, very difficult circumstances. And many of them had to leave because it's been impossible for them to build houses and so on. Israel makes it difficult, planning rules and so on. So you've got this very divided city. And Western journalists, when they go and live in Jerusalem, always go and live in West Jerusalem. And therefore, the context of their lives there is they hang out with fellow journalists, they go to bars where there will be, or restaurants and so on. Their social life is based around West Jerusalem. They hang out with Israeli Jews rather than Palestinians. Their bureau staff will be Israeli Jews, almost always in the western part of the city. And so the people they're using to fix their stories and they're looking to for advice and help when they first arrive will all be Israeli Jews. And so they're being given this context that this is the legitimate story. They're being presented with one side of the story. And you kind of venture out into Palestinian areas.
Jonathan, I'm just going to jump in on this because it's not quite related to journalism, but it's very similar. We have Canada has an embassy or a representation in Ramallah, but by Canadian law, those people are not allowed to live in East Jerusalem. They have to live in West Jerusalem. And a couple of years ago, the wife of the representative was learning Hebrew. So that gives you a sense of, I'm sure that same pressure applies to journalists as well.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, one of the things that it's difficult to talk about, but is definitely true, and I have mentioned it in a few articles I've written on this, is that many of the journalists who are being sent out by Western states, Britain, Canada, America, and so on, are very often Jewish journalists. And they're not only Jewish journalists, they're journalists who have family out there, identify with the state, and so on. And one of the things that quickly I became aware of being out there was how many of these journalists had children in the army or had even served in the Israeli army themselves, which is quite an extraordinary thing if you think about it. One of the things that journalists tend to think of, we're supposed to be there as neutral parties, we're disinterested observers trying to understand a situation from a position of impartiality and objectivity. That's the story we tell ourselves and we tell our audiences. And yet here you have examples where there are journalists going out who have very strong sympathies with Israel, identify with the state so much that they send their children into the army. I remember having a correspondence. In fact, if I can dig it out, I can probably find the quote where when I wrote an article about this, and one of those, he was a friend of mine, a Jewish journalist out there, told me, and this is a quote from him. He said, "I can think of a dozen foreign bureau chiefs," he means in Jerusalem, "responsible for covering both Israel and the Palestinians, who have served in the Israeli army, and another dozen who, like," and this was a reference to Ethan Bronner, who was then the New York Times bureau chief, "have kids in the Israeli army." So this is quite normal, considered quite normal, but it's quite exceptional. You wouldn't, we'd be quite stunned to see a bureau chief in Jerusalem who had a child, let's say, working in the Palestinian Authority, or was a member of one of the Fatah brigades, one of the militant groups, Palestinian groups. That would be entirely shocking to us, and we wouldn't for a second imagine that journalist could be seen as a credible, independent, objective journalist covering the conflict. And yet it's considered completely normal for this. It's been going on for decades and nobody questions it. And again, we get to this problem. Once you question it, say, well, aren't these journalists a bit partisan? Or how can they not have a conflict of interest if their child is serving in the Israeli army? How do you report on Gaza when your child is in the Israeli army and not take a side there? It's pretty difficult. Even if you try and do it intellectually, emotionally, it's going to be extremely difficult for you. And why is that not considered a problem by their editors? And that, again, brings us back to this question both of anti-Semitism, the idea that just to even raise this as an issue, even though in any other circumstance it would be considered extremely unethical for journalists to behave in this kind of way, is considered to be somehow anti-Semitic or suggesting these journalists are somehow biased. And so there's that kind of way of stopping people even having the conversation. And there's also, I mean, I think when we look at it, we see that often newspapers are doing this, or media organizations are sending out journalists who are not only Jewish, but have connections to Israel, because they think this is a better way for them to gain access to Israeli officials, because they're then treated as part of the tribe, the pro-Israel tribe, that they will be more sympathetic, they can be trusted, and therefore they will get better access and they will get better stories. And that tells you another story, which is that newspapers and TV organizations back in the West actually see access as only applying to the Israeli side of this. They're only interested in journalists having access to Israeli officials, Israeli generals, Israeli politicians. They don't really care about access to Palestinians, or they know that there's so much asymmetry in the relationship. The Palestinian officials will have to talk to these partisan journalists, whatever. Israeli officials can just cut them out and say, we won't talk to you. But Palestinians can't afford, as the weaker party in this, can't afford to exclude journalists. They have to, or whatever the terms are being offered them, they will go and talk to these journalists. So there's a complete asymmetry in the relationship between the officials on one side and the journalists, the Israeli side and the journalists, and the Palestinians and the journalists. So here tells us something also about the nature of that asymmetry and the way that the system is rigged, the journalistic system is rigged to prefer Israeli official accounts, access to Israeli officials than it is Palestinians. So there's another layer of it. I mean, there are so many layers, but this is another important part of it.
Jonathan, I want to pick up on that, and I'd love for you to take us through how what you're describing showed up in some of the reporting that you did. You wrote a long, detailed article about the many instances in which your reporting was either censored, altered, and just changed in favor of Israeli narratives. And I'm wondering if there's a particularly instructive or illustrative example that comes to mind as to what this looks like in practice. You have a story, you've written about something. What happens once it gets into an editor's hands, and how does it change in how it's published?
Well, often for me, the problem was actually the most important stories I was trying to get out were the ones that didn't make it at all. They were just, I mean, it wasn't that they were edited or altered. I just couldn't get them in the paper. It's difficult to think of one illustrative because I think they all illustrate slightly different things. and I don't want to take up too much time on this, so I won't. I'll try and keep it very short. But one of the first, I think, probably the first big run-in I had with my foreign editor was on a story about tear gas that was being used, a new form of tear gas that was being used in Bethlehem. This was back in 2001. And we'd heard reports from Gaza that there were examples of tear gas being used by the army. And suddenly, Palestinians who were exposed to this tear gas were having a very different reaction to any other tear gas they'd been exposed to before. And then I came across an example of this in Bethlehem, where the Israeli army had fired tear gas into a school in Bethlehem, and the classroom had got filled with this tear gas, and the kids had obviously poured out into the playground. And a couple of the kids got very ill, and one of them had this sort of weird convulsive attack and started frothing at the mouth and so on, and was taken off to the local hospital. And the local doctors there had thought that this looked like nerve agent effects of nerve agent, and had therefore referred it to a couple of French experts who were also doing volunteering in one of the other hospitals in Bethlehem, and they'd looked at it and they'd reached the same conclusion, that this had elements of nerve gas, and that the fear was that Israel was using an experimental new form of tear gas that was stronger than ones that had been used in the past. And so I had great quotes from these French doctors, eminent doctors who were experts in the field and so on. So I thought I've got a very strong story here. And I sent this in to the foreign editor, and the foreign editor was clearly not going to run this story. And being me, I kind of kept on pushing. I didn't, most journalists probably would have just backed off, but I wanted to know why he wouldn't run it. And it became clear very soon that for him, there were issues here, that the implication that Israel was using some kind of nerve agent had horrible parallels with what had happened to Jews in the Holocaust, in Auschwitz and so on. And he didn't want to get into that any kind of comparison. And therefore, it didn't matter whether the story could be stood up, whether it was true. He just wasn't going to run this story, whatever. So I kind of started, okay, there are different standards here. If this was Palestinians using this on Israelis, it would be a story. But if it's Israelis using it on Palestinians, it's not a story. Another illustration of this was this is a slightly different thing. This is the power of the lobby, which is so important for journalists, such a kind of dangerous group you don't want to get on the wrong side of the lobby groups, because they can do a lot of damage as a journalist. They can really damage your career. I remember I was writing for the International Herald Tribune, which is now called the International New York Times. And I was trying to get in there as an opinion piece, a short opinion piece about the wall, which Israel was just beginning to build in 2003 across the West Bank. And it wasn't building it along its recognized international border. It was building it inside the occupied territories, cutting Palestinians off from their land so they couldn't get to their farmland. And I remember pitching this and saying, wanted to write a story about how Israel was using the wall as a land grab to take land from Palestinians, steal more land from Palestinians, which is obviously a long-standing issue for Palestinians. The settlements are doing that and so on. There are lots of ways. In fact, 42% of the land in the West Bank is under the jurisdiction of settlements, so large chunk, and even more of it, and a further 20% is in an area called Area C, which is under Israeli control and effectively has been taken by Israel. So Israel has been slowly over decades taking more and more land, and the wall was just another way, another weapon for doing this. So it had a fairly strong argument to make. And the International Herald Tribune was very nervous about running this story, and I kept on pitching it in different ways, and they kept on batting it back to me, and they didn't really want to run it. And then I remember George Bush suddenly made a speech in which he said it was very important that Israel not use the wall as a land grab. And within an hour, I had a phone call from the deputy opinion editor saying, we want to run this story. They sat on it for 4 months, but suddenly, because Bush had said it, it was okay to run it. And so I quickly wrote the piece up, changed it just to update it a bit, sent it in, and the piece was published. And I started to realize why. I very quickly got a lesson in why the International Herald Tribune was so frightened to run this story. It sat on it for so long. Because immediately, I spoke to one of their junior editors there who said, we've just had the largest postbag in our history of complaints about your article. And it was a 600-word, very anodyne piece, really. I mean, just arguing that there was a danger that this war was being used to grab land. Now, I mean, nobody would question that. It's so obvious that that's exactly what happened. But we got the International Herald Tribune got the largest postbag in its history. It wanted to run a correction, I insisted it not do that, and the only way I could persuade them not to run a correction was for me to write. There was a formal complaint from the lobby about it. Wrote a very claiming 10 errors in my article. I then worked all through the night to answer those 10 complaints, point out that they weren't errors, there weren't factual problems with it. And to the credit of the Tribune, they did actually not issue a correction, which was some kind of small victory for me. But they did run a full page of letters of complaint, which was, I mean, all the letters. Usually, anybody who works in journalism knows that when you have a letters page and you run letters making different points. So if you run, let's say there's somebody complaining about an article, and you might run 3 letters, and you'll run 3 letters because they're all raising different issues. Maybe one's in favor of the article, one's against, one's making a different point, but they're all illustrating a different thing. The amazing thing about this letters page, there were about 15 letters. They were all making the same Hasbro Israeli propaganda point. It was just the same point over and over again. So there was no reason to run a letters page like that. But the Anti-Defamation League was the one that had led this. The reason there were so many complaints is that they'd put up on their website a sort of pro forma complaint, so that anybody who supported the Anti-Defamation League could just sort of copy out the letter and make a few adjustments and send it in. So this was an organized campaign. It's something we know very well now. We see that happening a lot, but it's been going on for a long time. CAMRA is another organization, stands for Campaign for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting. They have a whole page. I mean, I don't know if it's still there, but certainly when I was out there, they used to run a page of shame, or what they call the Wall of Shame, which had a list of all the journalists and the complaints they'd made. And you'd see all the best journalists out there. They all had at least one major complaint that had been made against them. And there was a general principle: 2 strikes and you're out. If the lobby went for you 2 times on a major issue, you probably get moved out of the Jerusalem bureau. So there's this kind of sword hanging over your neck. You knew that if you just stood out of line, you stepped out of line too often, the lobby would have your head and you'd be finished as the correspondent there, and you'd be moved off somewhere else. And so there becomes this kind of self-censorship. You know that you're being watched. You know that you've made a mistake already as far as the lobby is concerned. You've stepped into an area they don't want you talking about, and that they're gunning for you. And of course, you start reining back what you're saying, because you can't afford another complaint and the chance you're going to lose your job. So the lobby is very important. There are lots of kinds of issues here that the newspapers back in the newsroom, they're worried about losing access. They're worried about the lobby discrediting them. They're worried about the lobby accusing them of anti-Semitism. And that feeds down to the journalist. The journalist is worried because they're the target of this at the end of the day. The newspaper, if the newsroom gets too many complaints, you become too visible, they'll kick you out. Your days are numbered. So it's a very strong pressure both on you and on the newsroom.
Jonathan, before, we've talked about this topic before, so you have to remind me, but foreign journalists operating in Israel have to deal with issues like access, who's going to talk to them, and managing their relationship with Israeli generals or whatever in order to get stories, that there's a whole issue of censorship. So interested to know what's the short list of sort of major constraints, and how you successfully, or largely successfully, evaded them.
Well, yeah, okay. We'll get to the question of evasion maybe second. Well, so the main thing is there's this organization called the Government Press Office, which accredits journalists. And this isn't something that's spoken about very much, but the accreditation, well, okay, let's talk about how I evaded that. So when I first arrived in Nazareth, I didn't have accreditation with the Government Press Office, and I didn't want accreditation because when you get accredited, you have to submit certain, you have to kind of abide by certain rules. And if you don't abide by them, in those days, it was a bit laxer than it is today. But in those days, if you didn't abide by them, when your renewal came up a year later, they would not renew it, and you'd have to leave the country. So that was a lot of pressure on those journalists to keep with, not upset the Government Press Office. It would have cuttings files on each journalist, and they would look at what you were doing. And if they didn't like it over the course of the year, you wouldn't get your press pass renewed. So I didn't want to go down that path. And so what I did is I was reporting kind of below the radar. I didn't register with the Government Press Office. I actually, when I went in and out of the country, so nobody was actually looking at me. The government press office wasn't aware of me because I never registered with them, and therefore they didn't. You've got to remember this is in the analog days of hard copy before the digital thing really took off, and so mostly it was quite possible to just evade that kind of control. And I actually used to, when I went in and out of the country and they said, "What are you doing here?" I'd say I was writing a book about the churches in Nazareth, and because the officials, the border officials, are Jews. They know nothing about churches in Nazareth, and so they had no questions they could ask me. There's no way of testing whether what I was saying was true. And I managed for about a year and a half to keep coming in and out of Israel, basically on this story that I was writing a book about churches in Israel. And then I met Sally, who would later become my wife. And I entered at that point. I entered a sort of residency track that took many, many years, but it gave me the right to have a work visa and work in Israel. And so I didn't need the government press office accreditation to stay there to get a work visa, and so I avoided it that way. And then when I got married, the residency became stronger and stronger to the point at which I got citizenship after about 8 years of going through that process. And so I managed to evade the whole issue of the government press office. Now, that's not true for other foreign correspondents. I mean, maybe if you're Jewish and you can claim citizenship, then that's all right. But then there are other issues to do with maybe your partisanship. But if you're a non-Jewish journalist and you go out there to cover Israel-Palestine, you need to go to the government press office. Now, what started to happen in the early years I was there, sort of 2001, 2, 3, is you started to get these what were calling themselves the new activist journalists, and they were using the technological changes that were happening then. Before, if you wanted to be a foreign correspondent, you needed really the institutional support of a newspaper or a TV station. Why? Because you probably needed a satellite phone, which was expensive, to be able to file your copy from wherever you were out in the field. You would need a library archive to be able to find out background of what had been going on, so on, so you could write the context for your story. You'd have issues about how you sent the copy. That would be quite complicated. And you would need a bureau staff. You'd need a cameraman or camerawoman there to film the stuff or to take photographs, the visual side of things. There was a whole infrastructure needed around you being a foreign correspondent, and it was expensive. And so you couldn't really do it without the institutional backing of a news organization. That all starts to change about the time I go out there. Suddenly you've got email. You can send your copy anywhere in the world through email, no problem. You've got mobile phones. You can phone stuff through. You've got Google, which is as good as any library you're going to find in the Guardian or CBC or wherever. You've got digital cameras. You can record stuff yourself and so on. So you can become a one-person outfit, foreign correspondent. Suddenly you don't need all this other stuff. And this helped me. It was one of the reasons I could be a foreign correspondent when I went out there without the institutional backing. But it also meant you got a lot of young people who went out there and decided to embed themselves in Palestinian communities for the first time, before Western journalists started to corrupt that term, embedding. But they went and actually lived in Palestinian communities. So when the tanks rolled into Jenin, for instance, there were young people there with their digital cameras and later with their phones, and they would video this, or they would take pictures of it and they would send it out through email to people like me, journalists, and we would have moment by moment, blow by blow accounts of what was going on, real on the ground reporting of what was going on as it happened, and often confirmed through sort of visual testimony and evidence. So that was a really powerful new kind of journalism, and Israel very quickly worked out this was quite a threat. And so what it did is it changed the rules with the government press office, and it meant that you could no longer just accredit with the GPO because you wanted to do journalism. You could only accredit if you had institutional backing. So you needed a letter from something like the New York Times or the BBC or whatever, saying that you were there for them. If you didn't have that, Israel basically kicks you out of the country. So this whole layer of freelance journalists who were out there, who were independent, they weren't tied to a particular news organization, basically lost their ability to report. Sort of in about 2004, 2005, they all left. Also, we've got to remember those young journalists who were out there or activists who were doing this sort of new journalism. A lot of them were being shot at and killed by Israel. You remember Rachel Corrie, the bulldozer that came and crushed her, Tom Herndl, Brian Aidenry. There were a series of journalists who died in that kind of era. And a lot of those, it became very dangerous. And a lot of them were with a group called the International Solidarity Movement. And they were out there trying to show what life was like for Palestinians. And they had to leave. So that whole layer of activist journalists left. Freelance journalists were out if they weren't pro-Israel and they didn't have accreditation with an institutional media organization. And so what you ended up with is only the journalists who were tied to a major news organization. And that changed things dramatically because those news organizations, as we've already alluded to, had their own reasons for not wanting to lose access, for not wanting to be discredited as being anti-Semitic and so on. All those pressures that were there in the newsrooms, suddenly they were replicated just with those journalists who were out in the field, who were very sensitive to those concerns. And the independent journalists, they were all cleared out. And that really was a loss. But it left just a few journalists like myself, a few Israeli Jewish journalists who took a very critical view of Israel. So you started that was when websites like 972, which is a publication which has Israeli Jewish and Palestinian journalists writing, and they write often in Hebrew, in the original, but then those articles are translated into English. And that became an important source of news. You got these Israeli Jewish journalists often who were, because they had Israeli citizenship, they could write and report. And I suppose that was the same situation for me. I managed to avoid expulsion, which would have happened otherwise, through my marriage and my citizenship, residency, and then my citizenship. It became possible for me to hang on and continue writing without the threat of being removed. But that wasn't the case for most journalists who were forced out.
Pacinthe, do you want to, we've only got a limited number of questions, but Pacinthe, you go on and then we'll see how we're doing in terms of people raising their hands. Or please, just to remind people, raise your hand if you want to speak up directly, or put questions in the Q&A, or put them in the chat. And my colleague, Grafton Ross, in the background, he's monitoring that. Pacinthe?
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking us through this so granularly. And I think sometimes talking about this, people want to understand more of the dynamics that lead to the outcomes that we all know and feel. You've written that, reporting honestly about the realities in Israel can amount to what you call, quote, career suicide.
Mm.
And I can relate to this. I'll tell you very briefly. I mean, you've mentioned the ADL, you've mentioned camera. Here in Canada, we have a group called, I'm going to use quotes, Honest Reporting Canada. And they do a very similar thing where they essentially go after any journalist that either critique actions of the Israeli military or state, or say anything or write anything that can be deemed remotely pro-Palestinian. I'm very proud to have been written up by them about 5 times so far. The last one was in December.
Yeah.
I will say that at the time, when I used to work at CBC, getting written up by an organization like this is scary, and editors cow to it. You self-censor as well. But I can, it's hard to even still talk about to this day because of how formative it's been. But in 2017, as far back as 2017, I was working for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I ended up working there for 10 years. And the one story of mine that did not make it to air was an interview with a Palestinian American journalist. You may be familiar with him. His name is Ahmed Shahabuddin.
Mm.
And he was trying to tell the story of what it is to report in Jerusalem as a Palestinian American. He was stopped, he was questioned by Israeli soldiers and forces. And somehow I got this story to be greenlit as a pitch. We booked him, we produced the interview, we recorded it. And just when I cut it down and it was ready for air, I was told unequivocally, we are not airing this story. We don't have time to explain it to you. And my career seemed to hit a wall after that instance. And it was only when I left that someone on the hiring committee of the last senior job I'd applied for told me in no uncertain terms that my interview with Ahmed Shahabuddin and my desire to understand why it didn't go to air marked me as biased and therefore unable to lead to any kind of editorial leadership within the organization. And I left and wrote about this in my article for the Walrus. But I'd love for you to kind of break down what are the dynamics. How does the lobby actually make it so hard for journalists to get these stories up? What effect does it have on editors, on journalists themselves, and just the parameters of what you can even write about? How does it all work together to lead to an absence of any kind of Palestinian narrative or anything that can be remotely critical of Israel?
Well, I think one of the things we probably ought to be careful of is thinking that somehow this is being imposed, like the lobby has this magical power to impose these constraints on what you're allowed to talk about. It works because those constraints are there anyway. They would be there anyway, I think. The lobby maybe refines the constraints and delimits them at particular times, but it's working with a sort of larger establishment view of the world, which divides the world into friends and enemies. And so Israel, for Western states, is an ally, an important military ally, projecting Western power into the Middle East, the oil-rich Middle East. Let's add that bit because that's the important reason why it's so important. Um, and the Palestinians are a fly in the ointment because Israel doesn't want them there. It wants to take control of the land. It wants to have this area for itself. And so the narrative is already there for Western journalists. When you turn up, you're already aware that that's the narrative. And you probably think that that's actually that Israel are the good guys and they're on the side of us defending civilization. You know, Israel's narrative has always been there's a sort of clash of civilizations and there's a Judeo-Christian West opposed to a sort of barbaric Muslim East. And that's the sort of simplistic narrative. Netanyahu loves that narrative and he's always promoting it. But he's not doing it in a vacuum. It's not like nobody else is thinking like this. This is very much a kind of Western narrative. It goes back a long way. I mean, we've got to remember Zionism wasn't invented by Theodor Herzl. It's not although today we think of it as a kind of Jewish ideology of sovereignty in the Middle East in Israel. Its roots go back much further into Christianity, and Zionism was a Christian doctrine, restorationism, the idea that Christians would rise up and be with God, you know, if the Jews returned to the Holy Land and the Promised Land, and this would bring an end of times and so on. So there's this whole Christian kind of old school Christian evangelical way of looking at the world that Israel is central to, and this is one of Trump's major constituencies are the evangelicals who take this view as well. So whether or not Trump personally thinks like this, it's an important view of his base. And I think it's also, I mean, obviously, it gives a kind of ideological legitimization to the more material interests of controlling the Middle East, West controlling the Middle East, projecting its power, keeping control of oil, and so on, limiting potential rivals like Iran. So there's a whole kind of power politics going on here, and Israel is a player in that. And one of the reasons that the lobby wields the power it does is because it aligns with that worldview. If it didn't align with it, you know, if there's a Palestine lobby of sorts, isn't there? I mean, the BDS movement you could think of as a Palestine lobby. Does it have any impact? No. Why? Because it doesn't align with Western interests. So it's constantly treated as though it's anti-Semitism just to think about boycotting or divesting from Israel. So lobby groups have their success based on whether they align with a Western agenda, a larger Western political agenda. And so that's the way we should be thinking about these lobby groups, that they're not imposing a way of thinking about the world. They're simply amplifying it or making it practical. They're giving practical force to it. So rather than the government ringing up CBC and saying, we don't want stuff that's critical of Israel, you get a lobby group saying it, and their skill is in presenting this as though it's nothing to do with Western interests. It's to do with protecting Jews. It's about anti-Semitism, these other issues. So you start to legitimate the idea of suppressing Palestinian voices and Palestinian interests, and even covering up a genocide based on the fact that to raise these issues, to raise the question of genocide, has this implication that somehow you are opening a way to anti-Semitic discourse and threatens Jews and so on. So the lobby is there as a sort of practical fist, if you like, to warn journalists and media organizations where the boundaries of their reporting are. It's a very sort of concrete way. There's Greg Philo, who's an academic, late academic at Glasgow University, wrote a book about the Israel lobby, and he said, he talked to the, BBC producers, and there's a great quote in there where one of the producers says, "Look, we wait in fear for the phone call from the Israelis, from the Israeli embassy or from one of these lobby groups. They're terrified of these pushbacks against anything they write. And one of the ways they avoid that is by putting people in senior positions who are even more closely attuned to the kinds of views that the lobby have. One of the big stories here, probably hasn't made much impact with you in Canada, but it's a big story here in Britain, is one of the more independent-minded journalists, Owen Jones, did an investigation into the BBC and discovered that what he termed almost a civil war going on after October the 7th, and it becomes clear there's a genocide unfolding in Gaza. A lot of the younger journalists there want to start using the word genocide for what's going on, and they're realizing lots of stories are being repressed or they're not being given much space, and they start to push back against that. And one of the key figures in the BBC newsroom there is a guy called Rafi Berg, who is the online editor for the Middle East. Now, Rafi Berg is an interesting figure. He wrote a book with the Mossad. He counts Mossad, some of the leaders of Mossad, as personal friends. He hangs out with them. In video, he's done various Zoom conversations like this one, and in the background you can see hanging on his wall a letter of commendation for the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a picture of him embraced by the Israeli ambassador. He's done interviews where he says that the idea of Israel is, I can't remember the exact quote, but this idea of Israel as a strong military state gives him goosebumps. He feels pride in the idea that Israel is this strong military power. This guy is supposed to be the objective voice of person ensuring that there's objective coverage of Israel-Palestine at the BBC. He's clearly not objective in the slightest. He's not even making the pretense of being objective. Now, there's been a lot of pushback against him internally at the BBC. There's been a lot of exposure of his role there since Owen Jones published this article. And the BBC has done nothing to address those concerns. He's had no sanction on you. You've given us your story, but has Rafi Berg suffered any consequences for these very clear examples of him expressing his bias, his open bias towards Israel? Nothing. There's no price to be paid for him. And there's a good reason why he's there in the first place, which we ought to acknowledge, which is that having somebody like Rafi Berg, who's deeply embedded within sort of the Israeli military elite, counts these people as his personal friends, having somebody like that deciding what stories go in related to Israel and Palestine, and even the wider region, like to do with Iran and so on, is very useful. He is a useful gauge for the BBC. If he thinks it's a good story, or if he thinks this is the way to present it, the BBC is more confident that it's not going to get pushback from the lobby. Because in a sense, the lobby has their own representative there in Rafi Berg. He is the lobby's representative of the BBC. They're already controlling the coverage that's coming out to ensure that there's less pushback from the lobby. Even so, we see that the lobby, there have been a couple of documentaries that the BBC did that there was huge pushback on, in my view, entirely illegitimately, but one was about showing the children, the terrible impact of what's going on in Gaza on children there, how much they've suffered and so on. And the BBC ended up suffering because there was this technicality that the child narrator, whose words had been written for him anyway by the producers, happened to be the son of the agriculture minister. And the agriculture minister is in a Hamas government. It probably isn't him. He's just a technocrat. I suspect he isn't actually necessarily a member of Hamas, but that doesn't really matter. He's in the government. So the lobby has their way to discredit the whole program, which for the first time really showed the BBC using a documentary to actually show what life was like for ordinary children in Gaza. I mean, it's done so little to really show what life is like in Gaza properly. And here was the first time they'd done it. And of course, the lobby was going to go after that, where they were going to try and get it discredited, shut it down, and the conversations that might have emerged out of that documentary. and they did it by finding this technicality. So even then, the BBC is really doing as little as it can to tell us what's happening in Gaza, and even and people like Rafi Berg are critical to controlling what comes out via the BBC. But even so, the lobby is still pushing for more. I mean, it's insatiable. The lobby. You can never ever give it what it wants. It always wants more from you, always or less from you. It wants less from you in terms of criticizing Israel.
Jonathan, you're very hard to interrupt because you keep on telling us lots of new stories and information. But I see that there are a number of people who've either put questions in the Q&A, and I see that a woman named Elizabeth Ann, so I don't know, has her hand up for some time. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth if she wants to ask a question or make a comment. Do so if you're still there. I don't know. Are you there, Elizabeth? No, not, I guess not. Okay, hang on. Did I seem to have, what have I done here? Has to unmute. Elizabeth Ans, can you, talk, allow to talk. How about that? Does that work? Seems that there's a blockage on your, I'm sorry, there, Elizabeth. One more time, Elizabeth, can you talk? All right, no, it's probably my end, and I apologize. You have been patient.
No, I can respond. I just wanted to let Jonathan know that in 2019, he took us on a trip to explain some of the issues that were happening in Palestine and Israel when we came there with the university and MCC on a learning tour. And I just have been remembering you and keeping abreast on the issues of Israel and Palestine since then and praying for the whole situation. And I always join Zoom every Thursday morning to keep current that way as well and keep our church informed.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Elizabeth.
Nice to hear from you, Elizabeth.
Grafton, do you have some questions in the hopper?
Yes, I do. Ken asks, why does the Western corporate media not document how many journalists have been killed? And what does that mean for coverage of the genocide?
So why is the media not giving proper coverage to what's happening to Palestinian journalists? I mean, well, not least because it's so high. I mean, it's tied deeply into this question of Israel trying to hide what it's doing. You know, Israel has not allowed foreign journalists to. I mean, it gives you some idea because the argument I'm making here is that foreign journalists are very tame in our coverage of what's going on, where we give Israel the benefit of the doubt usually. Even so, Israel still doesn't want journalists going into Gaza because it knows that what it's doing is impossible to conceal. The crimes it's committing would be impossible to hide from journalists. Also, because a lot of foreign journalists would probably end up getting killed as well. I mean, if you're dropping 2,000-pound bombs that can kill people for half a mile in every direction in a tiny area of land, and you've got 50 foreign correspondents from the New York Times and the BBC and CBC and so on dashing around all over the place trying to cover stuff, you're going to end up killing some of them by definition. That's just going to happen. So Israel doesn't particularly want to start killing lots of foreign journalists, which it would have done if they'd been allowed into Gaza. Undoubtedly, that was part of its assessment. But also, they would have seen what was going on, and they would have had to have reported it in terms which they might not have used the word genocide, but it would have been clear that's what it was. So keeping them out was a very good way of, in a sense, giving them plausible deniability, giving the Western newsrooms plausible deniability to say, well, it's terrible stuff going on there, but, you know, it's the fog of war. Can't know what's going on. We can only rely on Palestinian journalists, and they're kind of not that reliable. Just like we can't really trust the casualty figures because it's from the Gaza Health Ministry. We can't trust the Palestinian journalists because they're probably sympathetic to Hamas and so on. And so they created this fog that wasn't there at all, but they created a fog by doing this. And then Israel used this kind of implicit acceptance by the Western media that Palestinian journalists, their coverage didn't really count, that they couldn't really be trusted, to then extend this. I mean, in a sense, I think the Western media coverage legitimated the mass murder of Palestinian journalists by saying Israel kind of ran with this idea then that, well, so the journalists are really in bed with Hamas, and therefore it's okay for us to kill them. And that sort of became over time, just as it did with the hospitals, oh, well, Hamas run the hospitals because they run the government. Therefore, the doctors are really with Hamas. Therefore, if we bomb the hospitals, that's okay. If we arrest the doctors and take them to prison camps in Israel and torture them, that's okay because they're all Hamas. Everything becomes Hamas. And the information is Hamas, the hospitals Hamas, everybody, the aid workers are Hamas, everybody's Hamas, and therefore we can do what we like. And that was, in a sense, we as Western media, we kind of accepted this argument, and therefore the deaths of these journalists. I mean, this is the biggest number of journalists killed. The number of journalists killed in Gaza is so huge that it exceeds all the other journalists killed in Western wars for the last 100 years or so. It's that off the scale. It's further evidence of the genocide, but we're not treating it that way. We're treating it as further proof. The implication, nobody's saying this, of course, in the Western media, but there's a kind of, through our silence and through Israel using that silence, entering that vacuum to make its own case, we're accepting by default the idea that these journalists had themselves to blame and that they were really not proper journalists, that they were pretending to be journalists. The whole thing is despicable, and it's not only is it a stain on Israel, but it's a terrible stain on the journalistic profession that we've allowed them to set this narrative, to lead with this idea. It's despicable. I don't know what more else I can say about it, really.
Maybe I should flip it to Pacinthe as to respond to a question rather than ask a question. You working for 10 years in CBC. I don't know whether you work mostly from home or whether you're in an office and whether you talk to other people, but what are the pressures on those journalists to not report or talk about or make a big deal about the fact that so many journalists have been killed?
Anecdotally, I'd like to echo a little bit of what Jonathan alluded to. I mean, first and most insidious is really the self-censorship, right? When you're a journalist working at an organization, you just want the story to be greenlit. You want to show that you can get stories up on the air. And knowing the track record of how willing an organization is to talk about Palestinians, especially Palestinians and them being targeted by Israel, it's just not likely to move forward.
Because let
And
me
then
just, can I just, so what I hear you saying is that as a young journalist, you want to move up, you want to be successful. And so, and you want your stories to be taken up. And so you're under pressure to not take up story, not to spend time on stories that they're not going to do. That's not good for your career.
Exactly. You learn. I think, I've spoken to so many journalists over the last 2 years who many of whom, I think the overall majority of them still working at mainstream institutions here. I think every journalist, whether you know anything about Israel, about Palestine, whether you're Arab or not Arab or Muslim, it really is, this does not discriminate. There are so many journalists who've come to me with an anecdote of the moment they realized Palestine is the electrified third rail that you do not touch because it will backfire on you. And so you learn that very young. And I think if not for my upbringing I grew up in the Middle East, I grew up in Dubai and Saudi Arabia, I grew up with Palestinian friends, I grew up with Palestine in the news. When I came to Canada and saw just how hard it was to talk about it, I won't lie. I mean, I really kind of towed the line as well for a moment. And then when that instance happened to me in 2017, I thought it was such an egregious violation of press freedom and transparency and accountability and editorial clarity, which are things that we say we pride ourselves on. But once again, this was the Palestine exception illustrated. So I think there are a lot of people in journalism right now wondering, especially younger journalists, really wondering, and I'm going to flip this question to you, Jonathan, because I get it a lot and I'm a little bit at a loss as to how to stay in this industry, be able to do this kind of work and still have a future. I myself have left mainstream institutions. I haven't been part of one since 2019. And I'm wondering what kind of tips, advice, do you have or guidance for younger journalists, or maybe not even younger journalists, any journalist who sees what's happening and has felt unable to confront it lest it backfire on them and, you know, it messes with their livelihoods and their mortgages and the ability to put food on the table? What do you think?
Well, I suppose there's this question: is the corporate media reformable? You know, can it really represent groups like the Palestinians? Are they ever going to get a fair hearing? And I think they won't as long as we have the political systems that we have and the corporate media reflect the political ideology that's dominant here. You're as a young journalist coming into you think you can change the culture and you can't. The culture changes you or it breaks you. Um, it broke me, you know, at the end of the day, I had to make a decision. Was I going to stay and keep compromising and start to hate myself, or was I going to leave? And as I said before, I was very lucky that the time I left, it was possible because of those technological developments that I could make a career for myself. And actually, if there's one small sign of hope, it's that the equation at this power differential between news organizations and journalists has started to shift slightly. And okay, I'm talking from a slight position of privilege in the sense I'd already established some kind of journalistic track record at the point at which I broke with it. If you're a very young journalist, you haven't really got a name for yourself and so on, and you're trying to make a name for yourself, there are ways in which it's probably harder to do what I did. But still, I don't think it's impossible. You know, if I was going to say to a young journalist, I mean, I get young journalists saying to me, you know, how do I change the news organization, or how do I live with the compromises I'm making? And I say, well, if you can live with them, you can live with them. But if you can't, you're going to have to get out. And if you want to continue being a journalist, you've got to find ways to become your own news organization. And you can do it. It's possible now. There are ways to do it. In the area which is my specialism, I suppose, being a foreign correspondent, I think maybe in some ways that's not a bad way to go if that's something that interests you, is you go and you take your recording equipment and your microphone and all that, you create your own little mini lab, and you go out to somewhere that interests you, that you think you know something about, and that you can tell these human stories about, and you go and cover it. Now, there are dangers, of course. And if you go to war zones and stuff, if you have a newspaper organization behind you, you've got the flak jackets and helmets and the insurance and all the rest of it and the training. Whereas if you're just a young journalist, you go out, in some sense, you don't know what you're doing. And that can be quite dangerous. And I think we need probably to develop institutions that start to replicate news organizations, the kind of training and insurance and help that they give to journalists, but without the control that they also impose. And so these young journalists can go out and they can start reporting without those constraints. And I think you can build an audience for yourself doing this kind of thing. And you see people doing it. You know, people go out to Ukraine or whatever, something where there's things happening and they do on the ground reporting and they tell you the stuff that's being filtered. And they give you this raw, naked kind of look at the world as it is, rather than as it filtered through kind of ideological lenses. And that's very appealing. I think there's a huge appetite for that among audiences. And you can develop a following that way, and you can build a basis of readers. And I think readers are becoming more used to the idea of paying for content that they actually want, and not thinking that they've got to get their or they should get their content from, you know, state broadcasters and billionaire-owned media and so on. And that's a change, and it's happening slowly. You know, we're as independent journalists trying to find a way to cope with this. We're struggling to work collectively to do it. You know, I think we need to be thinking about how do we create. There are examples of this, but I don't think it's happening enough. You know, what we've got is a lot of very successful former corporate journalists If you think of people like Glenn Greenwald or Matt Taibbi and people like this, and they're making big names for themselves, and they're probably earning a lot of money on their reader backed platforms, but they're doing their own thing. And I think we need something else which also creates a kind of platform where we can get journalists who are really truly independent, who care about telling stories from on the ground and telling stories from working in, because there are lots of organizations out there that want to help you do that. There are all these NGOs, charities, and so on out there, human rights groups, trying to get information out. And they're often not very good at telling stories, but they can work with journalists and help them. A lot of the best stories I wrote, I got the story from a human rights organization or a local legal group that was doing work, or activist groups and so on. And you can go to them and they'll help you find the people you need to tell stories. So I think we need to get more organized and help these young journalists to find new ways to tell stories using the technology to reach audiences directly. I think there's an appetite for it. I mean, there is a game of cat and mouse as well. We know that we at the moment we're dependent on platforms. Those platforms are still owned by billionaires, and so it's a cat and mouse game with them. The algorithms are skewed to make it harder to find independent journalists. Shadow banning, all these kind of covert manipulations going on to make it hard for journalists to reach audiences. So we've got to be canny as well. But I think that there's a fight to be had here for as legacy media becomes more and more discredited. And maybe not so much among an older generation, but I think a younger generation is much less. I mean, I know TikTok is, everybody's worried about TikTok and so on, but part of that fear is a reflection of the fact that there is this more chaotic news landscape now. It's less clear where are our North Stars, who do we trust, who is authoritative. These questions are breaking down, particularly for younger people. They're much more aware that you can't trust somebody just because they work for a major legacy news organization, that these organizations are run by very powerful people with lots of money, and they have their own agendas. So in this chaotic landscape, it's hard to find a foothold, but there's a battle to be had here, to be waged. And we have the chance to kind of remake the idea of what news is. And that's something we need to get more organized as collectively as independent journalists. I think we need to start thinking about networking better, creating platforms that we control rather than the billionaires control. So it's a process, and it will unfold, I think, over the next 10 years.
We're going to have to turn to there are a couple of people who've asked questions, and I'm going to pick up some of them. And Grafton can help me here, but a couple of people have asked your opinion about Haaretz, the newspaper. Quick answer.
Well, yeah. So I remember when I first went out, Haaretz is in English. It's a serious newspaper, has big, serious articles, covers lots of stuff about what's going on in the occupied territories. And I remember reading it, and I'd read one article and think, wow, this is, they really understand what's going on. They really tell the story from the Palestinian side. And then I'd read another story on the opposite page, which would be so Israeli centric, would view the world so much from Israel's perspective. So the Haaretz is a good example of a publication which I suppose in many ways it's a bit like the best that you can get of liberal Western media. It sees the occupations as a blight, as a kind of erosion of what Israel could be, and it sees it as a kind of gangrenous limb that needs to be amputated, and then you could restore the health of the Israeli body politic. I don't look at things that way. One of the things, being out there for 20 years or more, I started to realize, no, what the occupied territories are is actually an outgrowth of what Israel is. It's once you start to see there's something special. I mean, Israel has cultivated this idea among a lot of Israeli Jews that they are somehow the chosen people, that they have a certain special right to the land, that this connection to the land predates the Palestinians, and it's a God-given right. Even the secular Jews often feel this way. There's a sort of God-given right to the land, and therefore the occupied territories are a space which is there to be filled. There's still some sense there's a land without people, not because there aren't people there or Palestinians, but the Palestinians somehow don't qualify quite as real people, that they're slightly less than fully human. And we've seen this, of course, playing out very graphically in what's happened in Gaza with the whole human animals comments from Israeli generals and so on. But this is somewhere in the Israeli, a lot of the Israeli psyche, this idea that these are Palestinians are not fully human and therefore they don't have the same rights as Israeli Jews. And that's what's allowed the occupation not only to happen, but to expand and intensify over decades. And Haaretz really struggles to deal with that question. It treats it as though there are the settlers who are bad and they need to be brought back into Israel and everything would be fixed. But the settlers represent a large constituency, including, I mean, it's not just that people who believe in the ideology of the settlers live in the settlements. Also, those people live inside Israel as well. So the settler ideology is something that can be found widely across Israeli society. These people aren't going to stop believing that they're superior and they have God-given rights to the land just because they're brought back into Israel. There will just be a civil war inside Israel. And this is something Haaretz struggles to deal with. It wants to just think there's some clean surgical operation that could be done to get rid of these horrible, diseased settlements and restore health to Israel. It's not that simple. So in that sense, Haaretz has a lot of good journalism, particularly about the occupation, but it tends to have a major blind spot in what the biggest problem is, which is there's this ideology of sort of Jewish supremacy, Zionism, which ends up legitimizing the oppression of Palestinians.
Grafton, I'm going to ask you to find one more question to pitch to Jonathan and or Pacinthe, and then we're going to have to move to winding up.
Oh, okay. Well, Jonathan, maybe you can answer this quickly or maybe not at all. Emil was pointing out an article by Carl Bernstein alleging that the CIA has officers embedded amongst journalists or journalists work for the CIA. And is this a thing? And is this well known amongst journalists? And does that affect how you interact with those people?
I'm not sure it's that well known among journalists, but it's pretty well documented. In fact, Bernstein isn't the only person to write about this. It's been written about extensively. Nick Davis is a Guardian journalist who wrote a book called Flat Earth News a few years ago. Has a whole chapter on how the CIA and also the British security services set up these media front bureaus. So they look like they're local newspapers, but they're actually being fed stories by the CIA. There's a kind of laundering process. This isn't restricted to the CIA, but the CIA is a good example of how this kind of works. So the CIA will set up a front news organization, maybe a local newspaper and in English, in some place that it's targeting for potentially regime change or destabilizing the regime or whatever. And then it will plant stories in that publication. The publication then has it on the front page. And then, the president in the US will say, there are these terrible things going on in this country. And here's the local reports. So you're creating a news agenda, which you're then feeding back to yourself to justify what you're going to do or what you wanted to do anyway. So this has been a kind of CIA strategy for a long time. It's well known within a kind of media criticism circles, people who are looking critically at what the media is doing. Academics, I think, are quite aware of it. Are journalists as such? Not really. We tend to like to think of ourselves as the good guys, as the watchdogs on power and so on. We sell that narrative to ourselves. And we don't tend to like looking at people who are suggesting otherwise. I always remember when I was at the Guardian and the Observer newspapers, which are very liberal publications by British standards, there was no person more disparaged in the newsroom than Noam Chomsky. Why? Because he had co-written a book called Manufacturing Consent about how the media is there to manufacture consent for primarily US foreign policy. And that journalists don't like to see themselves as though we're being used or we're part of a bigger agenda that we're not directly influencing, that there are bigger forces at work that controlling and shaping the kind of things we write about. Even though, of course, billionaires own most of these publications. They're dependent on corporate advertising. Corporations have strong views about what their interests are. So of course we're being shaped by these bigger economic forces and interests. But if you start talking about that, most journalists recoil because we don't like to think that somehow we are not in control. We're not masters of our own journalism.
So Pacinthe and Jonathan, we're moving to the end now. Pacinthe, you told me that you are working with some other people in an organization in Canada, journalists, trying to wrestle with this question about reporting on Palestine. Can you just say a word or two about that organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So in June of 2025, a group of Canadian journalists who call ourselves Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine started an organization to try to contend with this issue in an organized format. The last 2 years have really, raised the stakes of how urgent this is. And I think many people are wondering what to do. So there's an organization, if you're in Canada and you care about this issue and you're wondering, how can we're trying to do a few things: support Palestinian journalists on the ground, challenge, the pro-Israel narrative that has a foothold in many Canadian newsrooms, and offer support to Canadian journalists who are trying to navigate this. We've had events, there's programming coming up. We're still in our infancy, but if you're interested in finding out more about our activities, go to Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine. We have a website. We're also more active on Instagram. And it is just an attempt to kind of reckon with this issue in an organized format through journalists who care about it and care about accountability and transparency, and to lend support to our beleaguered Palestinian journalists in Gaza and beyond. So thanks for asking about that.
Yeah, thanks, Pacinthe. And I will include a link in the follow-up email that goes out. Now, uh, Jonathan, first I want to personally thank you for the time and energy. Jonathan, you have to make a living out of this. And OFIP is glad to offer you a small honorarium for your time, and we appreciate it. That you also have a website where people can subscribe to. I'll put a link to that as well. So people check out what Jonathan has to say and make a contribution if you think it's worthwhile. And while I'm at it, I'll make a pitch to the audience that we also, the Ottawa Forum Israel Palestine, has ongoing expenses, not very many, but we're always happy to get contributions. And in the follow-up email, I'll tell you where you could send a few dollars. That we have the Zoom account and the MailChimp account and the maintaining the computer and so on and so forth. We're all volunteers, but we have to keep body and soul together. So I thank all the audience for participating. It's 4:15 now. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I feel like asking questions of Jonathan is sort of like trying to take a sip of water out of a fire hydrant. There's so much information, and it's delicious but frustrating and wonderful at the same time. So Jonathan Cook, thank you so much for your time. Pacinthe Mattar, thank you so much. It's lovely to see young people, young journalists getting to work on this, and I wish you all the best in your career as it goes forward as well. So I thought thank you to Grafton Ross in the background for helping us monitor the questions and so on and so forth. So once again, signing off until next time, thank you so much. Peter Larson here at the Ottawa Forum on Israel Palestine.